What's up, guys, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I want to talk about my 1960 BMW 700. It's technically a BMW 700 Sport Coupe, and this is a German market car that was privately imported from Germany at some point in the 60s or early 70s. It was here for quite a while before I found it. BMW made the 700 from 1960 to 1965. And it was kind of a last-ditch effort to pull themselves out of bankruptcy, as their production of the 507 in the 50s basically tanked them. So the 700 was basically the successor to the Isetta, and then the Isetta 600, and then the 700 was now a micro car, but a full car, bigger than the Isetta. So at the beginning, they made a coupe, and then they made a convertible, which only made a few of. Then they had a saloon. And the saloon, although it was still a two-door, was a larger roof with a larger side window behind the driver's door. The coupes became kind of the rarest out of them all and were definitely a bizarre-looking car. They had a real short roof line with a real small little pop-out pie window behind the driver's door. So the one I found was a 1960 first-year German market 700 Sport Coupe. And the cool thing about the Sport Coupe was not only were they one of the rarest of the 700s that they made, the Sport was a twin Solex carbureted two-cylinder air-cooled motor in the back. Most of them just had a single carburetor, and then the Sports had two Solexes and had much more power than the normal model 700s. My father and I built this car over the winter of 2018 into 2019, but I'd actually found and purchased the car in summer of 2017. Although I had started a YouTube channel by the time my dad and I started this actual project, I didn't really do a good job of uploading videos or even doing a lot of commentary day to day as we were building the car. So now, as I'm coming to you in December of 2020, basically the end of December, I'm looking back on the footage of that project with my father of getting that 700 put together. So all the video footage you're going to see of the project is from 2018 to 2019. I'm just adding commentary over it since I didn't do a good job of describing what we were doing and at what stage we were at while I was filming us in the shop. So in 2016, I met a gentleman who lives about an hour north of me, up in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire, that has kind of been a local legend for a long time now. And he's got a boneyard of BMWs and European cars. Once I got a first look at the 700, I couldn't believe I was looking at one. I mean, and this thing had been in his yard for a couple decades or more and sitting in the grass and had just rotted right into the ground. And there were trees growing inside of it. It had sat on a stump on the B-pillar, so as the car rotted into the ground, part of the car buckled on the B-pillar and kind of buckled the roof a little bit. It had broken taillights, and the BMW 700s had a real bizarre looking taillight. And I remember telling him, like, man, where would you ever find, original taillights for a BMW 700? And he says, looking over the fence, he's like, well, the other one's got good taillights on it. And I was like, one, the other one, first of all, and two, has good taillights on it. So now I find out that he not only has one, but two BMW 700s. Once I got a look at the saloon had actually rotted in half. Like, the front end of the car was in a different area of his yard than the rear end of the car. But that saloon had some good parts on it that were also interchangeable to the coupe, like the taillights. So we just kind of chit-chatted about 700s and weird, quirky BMW cars in general, and I went home. And that upcoming weekend was Memorial Day weekend. And the whole weekend, I was just plagued by thoughts of this 700. And just kind of couldn't believe that there was one within an hour of my house. And after the weekend, actually it was Memorial Day itself, that Monday, I drove up there. And this is a guy that doesn't answer his phone. He's got a landline, never answers his phone, never really calls people back. And so I drove up there, and he was outside. And I said, look, I can't stop thinking about this 700. What would it take, to get that 700 and the saloon? And this guy's kind of known for not selling any of his projects. Like I said, we had kind of struck up a relationship over the last couple of years. whenever I would show up, I was never there to get anything, nor did I ever go home with anything. So whenever I showed up, it was basically to just talk and tell stories and just kind of hang out. So to my utter surprise, he was willing to let the 700s go. And we worked out a deal, and I was just over the moon, over the moon. Couldn't believe that I was going to be able to take these projects home. And basically, I had told him, I said, you know, these will be going to a good home, and this car will see the road again. It will see the road again. And I think that's the only reason why he was interested in letting that car go, was he had seen it in his backyard for decades. So the real project was about to begin, the first major project. Unfortunately, the main 700 I was going to be trying to ultimately build was the coupe, because that was obviously still in one piece for the most part. And that car was in beyond his driveway quite a ways. And there were numerous, almost immovable cars that had to be moved in order to get to the 700. He had a few Porsche 914s, a Beetle, and a couple other cars that had been there just as long as the 700 that had kind of rotted into the ground that would have to be moved. My father owned a towing company for about 40 years, and luckily he is an expert in moving objects that don't really want to be moved. So we planned out an entire day for the production of trying to extricate this 700 out of the woods. We loaded up my dad's John Deere tractor, we brought chainsaws, we brought weed whackers, we brought a gas-powered air compressor to fill tires if any of the tires would hold air. We brought sheets of plywood, we brought go jacks, we brought axle dollies, everything we thought we were going to need out there in the woods to get this car moved.
All right. Yeah. We'll send you pictures of what we're doing. Well, it's a rare BMW. It's for John.
Yeah. It's for me, all right.
Yeah.
So once we get a bunch of the cars moved, we get to the 700, we start to try to lift the 700 up out of the ground to get some dollies under it. We realize that the car is really, really tender, and there's nothing left of the floors. It's a unibody little car. The floors were completely gone. Like I said, there were trees growing inside this car. So the second we tried to start moving this car, it just wanted to fall right apart. Like it was just trying to just completely fall apart. So we ratchet strapped the car together. We ran some 2-inch ratchet straps all the way around the car to kind of hold it together. We got it up out of the ground. We were able to get dollies under it and plywood out to the driveway, and we were able to get it all the way out. We had to turn it 180 degrees around, and we got it on the trailer with keeping it in one piece. Once we got it back to the shop, we were able to get it off the trailer in one piece, get all the dollies out from underneath it, and then from there I really just started to clean it up. I pulled all the vegetation out of it. There was dirt and leaves and all sorts of junk stuck inside the car. Once that was all out, I got a better look at what was left for metal, you know, where the floors used to be, where cross members were, where any structural parts of the car still were. I cleaned the windows up. That made a huge difference. Once I cleaned the windows up and pressure washed the car, it actually looked like a car again. And that kind of helped spark some motivation. From the get-go, the plan was to put this BMW 700 body down over a Volkswagen Beetle pan. Not just because the floors were rotted out and the overall state of the 700 was in pretty bad shape, but the fact that with a Volkswagen Beetle pan underneath it, I was able to find parts. Like parts availability was going to be there. So I found a pan. Another local guy that's kind of a local Volkswagen air-cooled guy had a pan. It was a late 60s pan, so it was a ball joint front end, independent rear suspension pan. Had a 1500 single port motor in it that was all there. It was disassembled, but the block and heads were still in the car, bolted up to the transaxle. Once we got the pan back to the shop, basically first step was getting the motor put back together and getting it running. Got the carburetor all rebuilt, new gaskets, got that on, new fuel pump, new push rods, push rod tube seals, all the ignition. I did everything from the distributor out on the ignition and got the thing running, and it honestly ran spectacularly. That was the first step before we started to work on the suspension on the pan. Not only were we bagging the pan, because I really wanted this car to lay completely out, but also be drivable and not be a complete nightmare to drive touching the ground. but the wheelbases were completely different from the Volkswagen Beetle to the BMW 700. The Volkswagen Beetle wheelbase was over a foot longer than the 700. So that gives you kind of an idea, without being able to see the car, gives you an idea how small that 700 really was. We were going to have to bob the pan down by over a foot, by almost 13 inches really, to meet the wheelbase of the body of the 700.
Yeah, I guess once we cut this section of tunnel out, we can get at those e-brake cables anyways.
So we've cut the pan down. We took almost 13 inches out of the wheelbase, about 12 and 3/4 of an inch. And now we're just kind of massaging everything, all the corners and stuff, to get it to overlap where we can weld it back together. Once that was done, we moved on to the suspension part of the project. I decided to run a 2-inch narrowed front beam. Again, this was a ball joint setup, so I ran some 2.5 or 3-inch drop spindles up front. So between the drop spindles, the narrowed beam, that was going to allow me to get the wheels up underneath the narrow 700 body. Once the 2-inch narrowed beam came in and we got that bolted on, I had to cut my leaf stacks down because the leaf stacks in the front factory front beam were obviously 2 inches longer. So that was a learning process, cutting the leaf stack down and then having to re-drill the grub screw port for the actual screw to help hold them together so they can twist. That was a learning experience. Got that done, and then we had to shorten the tie rods down because now the steering had to be brought in as well. So we cut the tie rod tubes and got those shortened, and then we moved to the rear. So for the rear, to bag the rear, I didn't go with any kits. We basically just built everything in the shop in-house. So we built a removable rear cross member, an upper rear cross member that the bags would actually mount to and push up against. A lot of times, guys will weld one to the casting of the pan itself, but then it's not removable, and it sits real close to the ears of the transaxle where it bolts to the engine. And if for some reason getting the motor out with the transmission was way easier without that cross member in, it'd be really difficult if that cross member was welded in. So we made a removable one that was still strong, that was still going to be able to carry the weight of the car, but it was bolted in instead of welded in. So once we got that done, we had to modify the lower trailing arms, get those mounted correctly for bag brackets, so the airbags didn't have to sit up on top of them, but could sit down inside the control arm a little bit. That way we could get more drop height out of the rear end. Once most of that was done on the Beetle pan, we got the BMW 700 up in the air, and I worked on gutting everything out from under it. So started to pull the transaxle, suspension, the front beam itself. It's got this really weird front beam setup in it. So we're kind of getting to the point where we're trying to get the body straightened out because the roof had a kink in it, and we've been working on getting the body as straight as possible before we started taking everything out from under it, prepping it to put it over the Beetle pan. The rockers are pretty much gone on this car. So the roof is basically holding it together because there's no floors. The tunnel basically might as well not be there either. So we're going to weld in some bracing where the doors are once you get those off. We're going to get everything squared up and just kind of make like a frame inside the body to keep it square as we lift it up and down off the pan. So we braced everything up. We braced crossways from front to back. We braced straight from front to back. And we braced in where the doors were. After a few test fits of lowering the body down over the pan, once we realized that the pan was shortened enough and for the most part narrow enough, we were going to be able to drop the body down over the pan with the lift, and keep test fitting stuff. It was clear from the beginning, once we started setting the body down over the pan, that the rear track width was going to be far too wide, even with the stock Steelies with small tires, to fit underneath the body. And we knew we had a ton of fabrication ahead of us, lots of design work and fabrication execution work to get done. So tubbing the rear end really wasn't on the drawing board at the beginning. That would involve, you know, narrowing the axles, narrowing the trailing arms, narrowing the upper cross member, and narrowing the torsion tube where the trailing arms mount to. This is actually something I still want to do in the future, but at the time we were going to look to alternative solutions than tubbing the rear end. But once we got the tires off the wheels and the wheels back on the pan's jacked up, and we were able to get the body set down over on the pan and get the suspension mounted up as if it was aired out, getting a visual of the wheels tucked up into the car was just insane, even though it wasn't really on the ground, it was up on jack stands. But the factory Beetle wheels were 15s, and that was actually the size of wheel I was really hoping to be able to pull off on this car. The factory wheels on the 700 were 12 by 3.5. So they were 12-inch wide wheels, or 12-inch tall wheels, I should say, by 3.5-inch wide. Seeing those 15s stuffed up underneath that tiny little car really started to bring the vision together in real life. So what I decided to do for the time being was to utilize the Beetle steel wheels, and we were going to cut the centers out and move them out on the wheel and re-weld them. Basically, changing their offsets to a much higher offset. My father, being completely down for almost everything that I was throwing at him for ideas on this project, decides that the best route to cut these wheels apart was to use the brake lathe that he has. We don't have a real wild machine shop in my dad's shop. And so what we did was we fixtured the wheels up on his brake lathe, and we used the cutting bit to cut the welds out of the center to release the centers. And so once we got the centers out, we were able to then move them from their normal position and calculate how far out we wanted them to go. We tack welded them into place. After we had them tack welded in place, we used the wheel balancer as almost a truing stand. We could hammer out our high spots or our wobble spots, and we could critique from there before we finish welded the wheels up. When they were all done, the fronts ended up being a 15 by 4 plus 67, and the rears are a 15 by 5.5 plus 65. To both my father and my surprise, once we got the wheels all welded up and we got tires mounted on them, they spun out and balanced perfectly on the balancer. I couldn't believe it. Obviously, the way you mount your tire can obviously depend on whether or not your wheel balances out. But the fact that we had cut the centers of these wheels out with a brake lathe, tack welded them in place, and then put them on a wheel balancer as a truing stand, and just kind of eyeballed them, welded them back up, mounted tires on them, and then all four balanced out perfectly, was just unbelievable to me. I mean, I don't think we could ever do that a second time around. But now that the pan was now sitting on the wheels on the ground with tires, once we got some body mounts fabricated and we got the two mated together, we got the body on the pan, the first time we set that car down on the ground off the jack stands, aired out, was just the craziest. Just the shock value to seeing a car this tiny laying on the ground with you standing next to it is pretty insane. Once they were mated together, we started working on finishing the tubular chassis in the front end of the body and framing in where we were going to mount the gas tank, where I was going to mount the air tank, air compressor, manifold, and all that. After that, we moved on to the floors. Since the Volkswagen Beetle pans taper in aggressively around the front wheels, they're not really a square pan like a Carmen Ghia pan. So we had to build some floor extensions to come off the pan to meet where the rockers were on the 700. And once we got that sorted out, we actually built rocker panels from scratch for the 700, since those were rotted out completely. There was one little section that was a few inches wide that we were able to save that had the full contour and shape of what the 700 factory rockers looked like. So we used that as our template, and we were able to use some flat sheet metal and bend up all of our aggressive bends and body lines, and then we used a piece of well casing in the shop, a long piece of pipe, that we were able to get our radius, our curvature of the rocker itself to look like the factory 700 rocker. I feel like I'm a sponge in the shop a lot when I'm around my dad, because some of the things he came up with for ideas to make that rocker were pretty ingenuitive, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it myself, that's for sure. But I'm super, super happy with how those rockers came out, especially since we made them from scratch. After the floor extensions were on, rockers were welded in, we moved to building firewalls. So we worked on building the front firewall from between the pedal cluster and obviously the front beam. And then we built a couple rear firewalls. And these firewalls are removable too, so you can access certain components for maintenance and whatnot. We moved on to the steering column, and that was a little bit of a challenge, mostly because of driver position. The OEM pedal cluster for the Volkswagen Beetle pan, where that mounts on the pan itself, in relation to where the dashboard is on the BMW 700 body, they were aggressively away from each other. They were spaced out in a very weird way. So basically, the pedal cluster, the pedals were mounted closer to you than the dashboard was. So we were going to have to stretch the steering column out quite a ways in order for you to be a relaxed driver position. We basically made a tube and stretched the steering column out. We utilized the Volkswagen Beetle 2-stud mount. So driver position got really bizarre in that sense, but comfort was key, and it's really quite a comfortable car to drive now because of that. So I kept the factory Volkswagen Beetle steering wheel, but since it's a BMW now, I didn't want a Volkswagen Beetle looking steering wheel. So I cut the horn ring loop basically off and just left the horn button that comes out the 2 spokes of the steering wheel. And then I designed, laser cut and laser engraved a 2-color acrylic BMW center cap horn button in the steering wheel. Once all the fab work was done, we had to wire the car, and we had to wire it 100%. Like, we had to wire it from front to back. For the most part, it wasn't a ton of wiring because it's a carbureted car. There's not a lot of options in the car for electronics or anything like that, but we did have to wire it from scratch. Once that was all done and the car was running and all the fab work was done, pulling that thing out of the shop for the first time and airing it down outside to get a look at it from a distance was just incredible. That was another one of the biggest highlights of the project, was to see it, was first of all to pull it outside the shop under its own power and air it down on the pad and get a good look at it from outside. So much like my Corvair project a few years prior, the time crunch for this project with the 700 was to get it done in time to get down to Helen, Georgia for the Alpine Vag Fair show. Before Alpine Vag Fair, Helen, Georgia was known throughout the European automotive community for Southern Worthy, and that show was held up until 2015. So in 2014, that was the show that my dad and I were trying to get my Corvair done in time to drive the Corvair to Helen, Georgia for Solo that year. This specific year, I decided I was not going to be driving this 700 in May all the way down to Georgia and back. The Corvair trip took probably 10 years off my life, so I wasn't going to do that. But getting this car done in time to get it down to Helen, Georgia for Alpine Vag Fair was the time crunch, and we were able to get it done. Once I got home, I ended up buffing all of the paint out that was left on the 700, and that completely changed the overall aesthetic of the car. Up until that point, it was just faded single-stage paint that looked like a bluish chalkboard, basically, with a bunch of rust around it. And back last summer, I had an episode I posted here on the channel of getting the wheels all stripped down and powder-coated a super chrome. And so now, as we speak, the car looks even more fashionable now that it's got the paint buffed out, and the steel wheels are powder-coated chrome too. Well, that's it, guys. That's my 1960 BMW 700 Sport Coupe that is now half Volkswagen Beetle. I'm happy I filmed what I did and documented what I did. I really wish this had been a numerous episode project as my dad and I were building it, and I could have filled you in with a lot more commentary of the little issues we were overcoming and how we were overcoming them. But all things considered, I'm glad I had all the photos and all the footage I can put together for this episode to kind of bring it out of the archives. But thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Lots of big things and news coming for Ludwick's Garage and the overall channel coming pretty soon. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.